When I was 11 or 12 years old, I can remember thinking if I could turn out to be just like anyone in my family, I'd want it to be my Grandpa Moore. And the fact that my grandfather and I were both born on Valentine's Day had nothing to do with it. His name was Wade Hampton Moore. He was born in 1900, and he lived in a small farming community of Cool Springs, North Carolina. He and his wife Elizabeth raised four lovely daughters there. And anytime you saw my grandfather, he'd be wearing bibbed overalls and a feed store cap. He was stocky but of average height, and he smoked King Edward cigars. And I thought he was the coolest man on the planet. My grandfather was a storyteller. Now, he was liable to launch into one at just any time. But my favorite time came in the evening after supper, when everyone would gather into the den. Now, I learned early on to scoot back up under the end table and be very quiet so my parents wouldn't notice me and send me off to bed. Now, when the talk first started off, it was usually pretty boring. Weather, crops, whatever was going on down at the church. But eventually, I knew my grandfather would get up, put another log into the wood stove, and when he sat back down, he would have a twinkle in his eye that told me he had thought of a good one. Well, my grandfather worked several jobs throughout his life. The one he held the longest was deputy sheriff, going all the way back to Prohibition. So he had dozens of stories of chasing bootleggers and breaking up moonshine steals. He played basketball in high school, a bunch of tough-looking farm boys with these heavy leather basketballs. He worked from time to time as a carpenter and a farmer, and for many years was a state game warden. I remember a sawmill story where everyone there was betting on my grandfather's ability with a .22 rifle. They took turns throwing whatever they had, pine cones, walnuts, small coins into the air, and betting on whether he could hit it. Most folks learned pretty quickly not to bet against my grandfather. My family moved away from Cool Springs early on, but we went back at least once a month to visit. And my brother and I would stay with them for weeks at a time in the summers. And no matter what time we were there or whatever my grandfather was doing, he was always happy to have me along. And in my experience, that was different from most adults. There are two situations that stand out in my mind. The first was training a hunting dog. Now, when his children were little, my grandfather was deeply into training foxhounds. And he and his buddies would set off late at night with coffee and a sack of sausage biscuits my grandmother had made. And they would sit out for hours just listening to the hounds baying off in the distance. This was literally music to my grandfather's ears. Even when he wasn't hunting, he would often go out at night just to listen to the hounds of the other hunters. By the time I came along, the foxhounds were long gone. But on this particular day, he was training a young beagle pup, and he invited my dad and my brother and me to go with him to the empty field out behind their house. And this was late fall, so nothing was growing. It was just long rows of empty field with woods along the back and down one side. My dad was holding the beagle by its collar. From somewhere, my grandfather had a rabbit in a gunny sack. And he held that burlap bag over where that dog could get a whiff. And both of those animals reacted. That rabbit was kicking in the bag, and the dog was, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to go. Well, they released the two animals at the same instant. And what followed was the most intense sprinting competition I had ever seen. That rabbit shot straight down one of those long furrows, and that dog was right behind him. And every time that dog started to close in, zip, that rabbit would come off in another direction. And they did that over and over. Now, I can confess something to you that I might not have admitted to at the time. I was pulling for the rabbit. He was older, so he was smart, but you could tell he was getting tired. And that young dog just stayed on him and stayed on him. And right when I thought we were at the very end, that rabbit jumped straight up into the air, and that dog shot up under him. You could see him do this kind of backward slow motion glance as his body took him in the wrong direction. Well, as soon as the rabbit hit the ground, he lit straight for the woods. The dog recovered and went after him, but once that rabbit got to the woods, that was all over. And the other situation that stands out to me was that on Sunday afternoons, once a month, my grandfather would have a hymn singing, or they just called it a singing. And they would invite friends and neighbors from all over. A lot of people came. There'd be all kinds of cars and trucks in the yard. Everyone filed into the living room, which is where the piano was. My grandfather made sure all of his daughters could play that piano. We brought chairs in from every room in the house, and my grandfather had stacks of paperback hymnals, and my brother and I would pass those out. And let me tell you, these folks could make a joyful noise. Now, my grandfather would walk around the room and carry that hymnal. The thing that I remember, that I realize the most, is the progression that I made. I look back at myself as a self-conscious preteen who sang really softly. And I turned into someone who could carry a tune and would sing out loudly enough to lead a section of the choir. My grandfather carried his hymnal in his left hand and walked around the room. He wasn't really conducting, he was just keeping everybody together. And I remember the day when he passed right in front of me and realized that I had learned to sing a tenor harmony line. And he looked at me and he grinned, and he came back and he stood beside me and he put his arm on my shoulder. And we belted out the rest of that song, his baritone and my tenor. Now, my grandfather never said one word to me about that, but it's the kind of thing that sticks with you.
Yeah.
Well, by the time I was in my mid-20s, I was in Nashville trying to do the singer-songwriter thing. You would go out and pitch songs to music publishers. And I remember one of the first ones that I went to said, you know, most writers that come in here don't have as many songs about their grandparents as you do. And I immediately said, well, they didn't have my grandparents.
Right.
But writing songs about old memories uses the same parts of your mind as telling stories, writing stories about those. And I began to realize how many questions I had that I didn't know the answer to. And I worked it out to be away for a week, called my grandparents and arranged to stay with them. And the week that I was there, during the day, we did whatever they had on their schedule. I was usually helping Grandpa with something during the day. I remember trying to get an old tractor started. But in the afternoon, all three of us would crawl into his old Rambler. My grandparents would be in the front. My grandfather always drove. And I'd be in the back seat, kind of between them, so everybody could hear. And every day, we'd start off in a new direction. And every day, it was like taking the guided county historical tour. Around every corner was a stream where a sawmill used to be, or a bank that was robbed during the Depression, or some historic site that he had helped to rebuild or create. And in between those sites, I got to ask my questions. And I remember getting just a lovely story when I asked how the two of them met. They were both at a party at the home of a mutual friend, and they got to talking, and my grandfather-to-be, Wade, asked Elizabeth if he could give her a ride home. Elizabeth wasn't sure about this thing at all, but there was a preacher there who knew both of them, and he told Elizabeth he thought it would be all right. And by Christmas that year, they knew that they wanted to get married, and on Christmas Day, Wade gave Elizabeth a cameo, a brooch, a raised profile of a lovely young woman, and she gave him a new shirt. And Wade looked at that shirt and said, I believe I'll get married in that church. And he did. It was a wonderful week. In about 4 months after that, I was back in Nashville and the phone rang. It was 11 o'clock at night, but it was Nashville, so that could have been anything. Turned out to be my mother. And I knew it was something serious for her to call me that late at night. And she said, "Your Grandpa Moore is dead. He's had a heart attack." And we talked on a little bit, but it was not a long call. And the thing that struck me as I got off was that it just did not seem real. I was sitting on the edge of my bed and I said out loud, "My Grandpa Moore is dead." And then I said it again and again, but they were words, just words, words with no meaning, no meaning, no meaning at all until they did have meaning. And then the tears came, and I got out my guitar and started playing because that's what I do when I'm processing things. And later that night, I wrote a song that I was able to play and sing at my grandfather's funeral. Funerals are what they are, but the surprises came after that funeral. The church provided food for anyone who wanted to stay. So I'm sitting there with all these men who had known my grandfather at different stages of his life. There were old lawmen, fox hunters, one of his high school classmates, even a couple of guys he had arrested when he was state game warden. And several of them mentioned my grandfather's storytelling. And they commented on how he always laughed just as hard at someone else's stories as he did his own. Then I began hearing some stories I'd never heard before, which was not surprising, but some of them sounded like parts of my grandfather's stories that he had left out. I mean, I knew my grandfather played basketball, but I'd never heard about him leading a comeback against Statesville High in the championship game. And I knew my grandfather had chased bootleggers, but here comes this story about a 6.5-foot convict running down the highway, escaping, and with at least a quarter-mile lead, and my grandfather sets off after him. And he gets closer and closer and finally catches the man. And they're in this big bear hug of a fight. And the fella is biting and chewing on his left shoulder. But my grandfather held on until the other lawmen caught up and subdued this guy. And I knew my grandfather was an excellent shot. But I had never heard about him being recruited by the FBI to join a task force specifically to take out Al Capone. And, it took me a while to process. I may still be processing some of those things, but here's what I figured out. I figured out that I didn't turn out to be very much like my Grandpa Moore. I don't wear bibbed overalls or smoke cigars. I shot a .22 rifle well enough to get marksmanship merit badge in the Boy Scouts, but only on my second attempt. I was at best an average basketball player. And if I can run you down in a foot race, well, friend, you are slow. But anytime I tell a story or laugh at one of yours, and especially if there is a twinkle in my eye, my Grandpa Moore is here. And I am awfully glad that you got to meet him. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.